So back at our example from before, where we let this sphere fall into our cloth here. And what we want to do this time is we want to break our cloth. And we want to kind of make it tearable so that it can tear apart when something impacts it. Now, what you have to understand whenever you do some kind of destruction, and we will see that later in RBDs as well, we don't break something dynamically, but we break it first, glue it back together, and then break it again. And the reason for that is that we have more control about how the break will look like, so that we can't, we don't just get random result, but we can define the breaking. And we do this now with cloth. And for this, we use a constraint called Weld. This is the glue part of the whole thing. So what we have here is just from before the patch geometry with a couple of boxes to pin the edges in space. And then we have a sphere in its own group, and then two different cloth with different settings that control the two. That's really all there is. Now, what we want to do with the cloth is first, we want to break it apart. And for this, there is an important note called edge fracture. And edge fracture, what it does is when you put it in is you don't see much, even though it already did it. You can, in the edge fracture, make visible what it did by turning on the primitive piece parameter here, because that gives you an attribute. And then this button here allows you to visualize this attribute. And now you can see what it did. It basically, cutted our geometry in pieces. And when we simulate the whole thing now, you can actually see that, because if we rewind this and run this again, then you can see the whole thing instantly falls apart because it's now made of multiple pieces. Let's quickly turn off the visualizer, which this button here activates. We can turn it off here, or we could have turned it off down here as well. So back to our red, and you can see it now just falls apart. But that's not what we want, right? We don't want it to fall apart completely. We want it to only break once it gets some kind of impact. But before we do that, let's talk about how to control the fracture a bit more. So let's turn our visualization back on. And what you can do is you can control the amount of pieces you want to cut. And you can also, if you need more control, use the second input, because what it allows you now is you can use a curve, for example, with draw curve, which is perfect for this. So let's quickly turn the initial pieces off, so it's just one big piece. By the way, you can combine those two techniques, the second input plus the initial pieces. But for now, we want to use the second input curve. Let's quickly change the plane. And when I just draw something through my cloth, it's very straightforward to see what it did. And I just failed in choosing the right one. The reason is that my plane is in the wrong position. So let's quickly make sure that our plane is a bit higher. So something like this. Let's kill this first stroke and let's do this again. So now if I draw this, you can see that I can really just draw the pieces I want, which is really nice. Keep in mind though, you don't have to kind of cut the pieces off completely. You can also do something like this. Oops. So you can draw cuts that are not cutting the whole thing apart. Let's quickly have a look if we can see that if we simulate this. Yeah, you can see it. And this could be an easy and quick way of defining the breaks without having to do much more than that. We will look at a technique to control this even further, but for now, just keep in mind the curves don't have to go through the whole geometry. They can also just be kind of in a certain area. So as you can see, this works. For now, let's quickly move on with this, because we're pretty close already to probably the look we want. Let's turn off our templates and also our visualization. And this is what we have so far. But as you can see, it breaks before our sphere goes through, which is kind of idiotic. So how can we glue this back together so that it only breaks when we have a certain tension to it? And for this, we use the Weld constraint. Now, what's important to understand with the Weld constraint, it only connects kind of the same object with itself. And also it only works when the points of my geometry where the cuts are perfectly on top of each other. So this constraint is not used for combining two different cloth pieces, but really only for cutting holes in existing or cutting off pieces from existing pieces of cloth. Keep that in mind that otherwise you need a different kind of constraint. So when you drop this constraint and look through it, you can instantly see what it does, because it shows you in this cool kind of zigzag curves where it finds those points that are on top of each other and just kind of sews them together. And what happens now after I just dropped it, so you don't have to actually change anything, this is now connected again, and when I drop my sphere on it, it does not break anymore. Now, but we want to break it, right? We just don't want to break it instantly. And this is actually something you can change in the weld constraint, because by default the breaking is turned off. It just, sews the stuff together. But we can turn this back on, and now this number here means how much stretch stress we need for it to break. So it will not break instantly, hopefully, but only if there is some kind of impact, and there you can see it. So now we glued it together, and there is a threshold that we need to go above, and this is the stretch stress right now that we need to go above for it to break, which currently comes from our sphere here. So this gives you a lot of control, because let's say if we wanted it to be a bit less forgiving, then you could set it to 0.3, and now you can see it doesn't break anymore. Now keep in mind, this threshold is taking the mass into account. And the mass, as we know, is very important in every simulation, especially in Vellum. So currently, basically, the energy that is applied here, which we, by the way, we can visualize when we look through the Vellum solver. Under visualize, you can actually visualize the stress that is applied to the geometry. Under visualization, here you have different stresses. I don't want to go too deep into this, but usually you work with stretch stress, and you can now actually visualize where the energy, or where the where stuff is pulled apart, so where the stretching is happening. Now, what I want to show you is that, of course, in the weld, you can change this threshold to a lower number, but you can also just increase the mass of your sphere so that the energy that it kind of applies to the cloth is higher. So let's look for our sphere. And in this here, we change the mass to something higher. Let's say 1. And if you run the exact same simulation now, you should see, first of all, that there is more energy, which you can also see in the stretchiness of the whole thing, because basically the sphere is, I don't want to say heavier, because that's a little bit wrong in this context, but this is how you can imagine, because mass is not necessarily the same as weight. But what you can also see is that now the breaking is actually happening. So depending on what you want, you can work with a mass, or you can also work, or both, with a threshold. Now, besides that, and this is pretty cool, let's turn this back to 0.1, and we could change our threshold again to 0.1, so that we had it like before. So there's less stretchiness overall, but there's still a breaking happening. Besides that, you can also control the whole thing by yourself on a kind of area basis. So let's do this in a different way. This time we were clever and said, okay, the only area where the breaking can happen is actually in the middle. But if you would change this, and for this we just turn this off and activate our initial pieces again, and we make it a bit harder by creating a lot of pieces. And if we run this now, the weld, let's double check. Okay, it finds all the pieces, so it glues them together. But if we run this now, then what we can see is that, yes, it breaks only on the impact, but kind of it breaks everywhere. Sometimes that's what you want, and that's why I'm showing it to you. Sometimes you want kind of to have the reaction evenly distributed over the whole cloth. But that said, this one is a little bit too weird. Like, this is a bit too chaotic. So we want to maybe control this better. And you can actually do this. You can, even though those pieces are cut in multiple elements, like those, you can actually make sure that the stretch threshold is different in different areas. And for this, we can use in the Vellum weld, where the threshold is, a little function down here called scaling. So we could scale by attribute. And the attribute it will multiply this now with is called break threshold scale, which for my taste is way too long. So I shorten this to, just break. It doesn't matter. So you can change the name. That's my point, to something shorter. And we now want to paint this attribute on our cloth. Of course, you have to do this after the edge fracture. And what we do use for this is the new attribute paint that came in with Houdini 18, because this is exactly meant for this. And we just have to make sure that, first of all, we press enter to see actually what the attribute paint gives us. And we want to change the attribute we want to paint to the name of the attribute we use later. And now what we can do is, let's start by setting the threshold very high. So the number 1 is set. This is good. So let's draw the 1 everywhere. Let's press the visualizer again. Let me quickly make sure that this all works. Okay, so you have to turn on the visualizer again and then visualize the attribute break. And now what you can see is you can actually paint the threshold, and we can make this whole thing bigger with a radius. And now let's paint the 1 everywhere. Quick correction for me here. You actually don't have to paint 1 everywhere by hand. That's just me. But under shape, there's actually the fill function. And when you just click anywhere, everything is now 1, much easier. Something like this will work. So this is now roughly 1 everywhere. And what we can now do is we lower this to kind of, let's say 0.1 as it was before, and we paint it the less strong attribute in the middle, and maybe just for fun over here. Let me quickly smooth this. Okay, smooth is a bit tricky sometimes because it runs over multiple objects, but nonetheless you can see we painted an attribute. To double check, let's actually see what we did. Here is a new attribute called break, with different numbers, and this is what we just painted. So let's see how that influences our setting. Again, this only makes sense if you switch it to scale by attribute and put in the name of your attribute that you just painted. But hopefully what we should see now is that this influences the areas that break. Now, unfortunately, the whole thing is a bit too sensitive, and that is because the number we just painted is still multiplied by 0.1. So let's change the multiplier to 1. So that's exactly what we painted. And that's a bit too stiff. Okay, fair enough. So instead of changing what we painted, I just lower the multiplier overall until I find the sweet spot when actually something is happening. And yeah, we're getting closer. So let's go to maybe 0.3. So after a little bit of adjusting of the numbers by just painting it back and forth, so it looks like this now. Depends, of course, what you want. But I could now really find the numbers so that it breaks pretty much exactly like I want. I wanted it to break in the middle, but also a little bit on this side, even though that makes no sense. But it should stay together here. So it allows you to really kind of art direct your destruction, let's call it, and really gives you a lot of control over how your breaking plays out. Before I finish this video, a small note about weld constraints, which is special. You could argue that weld constraints aren't really constraints, and that is because when we look at the actual constraint curves that come out of the node, first of all see that there are the cloth constraints that come in from before. So let's disconnect those, and you can now see those connection curves that we've seen before. But when you check what they actually represent, they do not represent a weld constraint, they represent a bend constraint. So those take care of the behavior of the points, not really the welding together. This is controlled by a special attribute that you surprisingly find on the geometry. So let's change the output here. And on each point there is a new attribute, surprise, called weld. Here it is. And some of them are not welded, but the ones that are have a number that represents the points that this point is welded together with. So if you wanted to break a weld constraint, for example, you would not be successful by deleting any kind of constraint curves. You would have to change this weld attribute on the geometry points. And because this is so special, I wanted to add this to the video in case you're trying to figure this out, which some students contacted me about, and I agree, it's a bit confusing. So this is the beauty of Weld, and I hope this was helpful. So thank you very much and see you later. Cheers.